Welcome to the OutThere Colorado Podcast. We've got a special episode for you today, sitting down here with John LaConte, a reporter for Vail Daily and the author of a book about a somewhat infamous character whose namesake is on a lot of geographical features around Colorado. You'll find out more about that as we go. Pretty much, I wrote an article about this character and how his name is on a mountain range that is located in the Summit County, Eagle County area, and beyond. Um, and John reached out and wanted to help me clarify a few details and add some more context. Found the story absolutely fascinating and thought it would be interesting to get him on the show. Real quick, the book that John has authored is called Notorious Hunter Sir St. Gore, Deadly Legacy in Colorado. Came out in October of 2025. So if you want to hear more about this topic, make sure you check that book out. How are you doing today, John?
Great, Spencer. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, hey, I find this topic fascinating. It's one that I've kind of like looked into periodically over the years. By now, any listener knows that it is about Sir St. George Gore, namesake behind the Gore Range, and several other things in Colorado. A lot of other things in Colorado. Um, so yeah, I mean, I can't wait to hear more. But before we get into that, do you want to chat a little bit about who you are and kind of your professional background?
Yeah, yeah, I'm a reporter with the Vail Daily newspaper, and I've been there for about 15 years now. I moved around a bit doing different reporting jobs in California, at the beginning of my career, but when I landed in Vail, it felt like home, and it actually was quite literally home, as I have a lot of family in Vail. I live in what was my grandmother's home, and she moved out to Vail during the big recreation boom of the 60s. And so um I in being here in Vail as a reporter, I think when I moved here I was kind of real ambitious about thinking, oh, this will be a stepping stone. I'll be at a daily paper for a few years and I'll move on. But the stories that I was like encountering were, the whole world comes to Vail, and so in a single week I'll do stories about NASA training out of the Eagle Airport, and about you know the CIA using Camp Hale to
Mm.
to train Tibetan refugees, and like just like um, so many, like, just what I thought would be like major stories that I would have liked to work on at a big national publication. And so I've just stuck with this job, and have kind of taken to a more investigative role later in my career. And so yeah, I just I'm really happy here with this, and it's allowed me to kind of take some time and work on some bigger stories. And as I got more and more into long form, I thought, this particular story, which I think is kind of the biggest one that I've ever uncovered in my career, would be good for a book. And my editor at Vail Daily suggested I pitch it as a book. And sure enough, History Press said absolutely, we'd publish that. And I worked with the editors there for about 2 years, getting it done, or a little less than 2 years, and yeah, finally got it out in November or October.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, I've always been a fan of your investigative reporting in the Vale area. Been a reader for quite some time. I love how you're able to kind of get those details out of those local stories beyond just the headline, you know. So yeah, definitely
Thanks.
appreciate your work.
Yeah,
You're
yeah.
not
I think
mentioning it too. You're being shy. You also got a Colorado Press Association Investigative Journalism Award as well.
yeah,
Correct?
in 2023. Yeah, and I think that's I mean, to win, first place for investigative journalism at that event, I think is about the highest honor you can receive as a
Mm-hmm.
reporter in Colorado. So that was absolutely a career highlight for me, and sort of gave me the confidence then to actually pitch this book, saying, you know, that that this book is an investigation, and I actually have been awarded for investigative stuff. So I'm not just, you know, a guy on a bar stool telling you the story, because
Mhm.
I do think, kind of, if you do try to tell the story that way, you might sound a little crazy, honestly, like, oh,
Mhm.
and it takes you right to today, with recreation capitalism, and and stuff like that. So, but I think when you lay it all out in a book, and you kind of detail how Gore's story kind of takes us to today, um in that format, in a book format, it sort of makes the story a little more digestible, and I think it's the right way to tell the story.
Oh, for sure. And before we get into the Gore story, I am curious, maybe just out of my own curiosity, what was that award for? What were you covering in
Oh,
that?
police corruption. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Was that
I could
pretty
I
intense?
could tell you. Yeah, it was. You know, it started, as many of these stories do, as just like a quick story of a cop getting accused of getting kicked out of a bar and stealing a girl's jacket because he was cold, and then that cop, it was immediately fired, and I thought, geez, not even a warning. And then, well, we have warned him
Mm.
several other times. Okay, let's see those warnings, pulled these, I mean, I guess it's the equivalent of internal affairs, and
Mhm.
those are referencing other investigations into other officers. And as you just dug deeper and deeper, um, I, our former police chief, his department, just seemed to be, kind of a mess.
Mhm.
And I sort of got lucky that, a- as he was leaving, the new police chief who came into town was the former public information officer for the department. So he
Mm.
was, so getting the information, he really believed in transparency, and it was some of these, you know in internal affairs, that's not the actual name of what they call it, but that's, effectively what it is. We're pretty ugly for the department, but he was at least, he didn't do that thing that sometimes they do, where you have to FOIA every last document and
Mhm.
pay every, per page, and show up in person to get the printed page and all. He sort of, once he knew that I was kind of onto it, he went, okay, I can see where you're going with this here, you know here's the stuff,
Yeah.
go easy on us, kind of thing. And but yeah, it was just, it was, the funny thing about the headline. I really did not like the headline of the story, because it used the word investigation twice. It said,
Mm.
investigation of Vale officer reveals details into investigations of other officers, and but then again, if you're applying for an investigative award, maybe
Yeah,
it's good
there
to
you
have that word in
go.
there twice.
The ultimate buzzword in that
Yeah,
regard.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, very cool. That sounds like a fascinating story. I'll have to look that up
Yeah, it's
after
got
we're
some
done here. But
crazy stuff in there that you'd be surprised to hear. This was happening here in Vale prior to the dismissal of some of these officers. So yeah.
yeah, very interesting stuff. Yeah, let's get down to brass tacks, so to speak, here, and get into what we are both sitting down to chat about today, which is Sir Saint Francis Gore.
No, yeah,
Sorry,
just
Sir Saint
Sir Saint
George
George.
Gore.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Saint George.
George. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so with Gore here, he people may be aware that he had this infamous hunting expedition, essentially, that has kind of that story's been retold time and time again. It feels like almost a game of telephone is going on, where kind of some of these details have gotten skewed over the years and maybe exaggerated or maybe left out. Um, with all of the research that you've done here, would you mind giving us just, like a quick few minute brief of what took place?
Yeah. And I don't know, maybe it just kind of, for me and you, it might be fun to sort of start with how we came to this, because, like, and it's sort of how I came to it too, the same way you did the other day. Like, every few years, a story pops up saying, "Hey, can you believe this? Like this
Mhm.
guy killed 4,000 buffalo, and now there's a mountain range named after him." And the stories all sort of cite each other,
Mhm.
and no one actually cracks down to the original source material that often, and so the 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 essential story there, and so then I thought, okay, so I'll kind of do this book and kind of really flush it all out, and then the next person who comes along and finds a story will find my book,
Mhm.
and will kind of and then so you can imagine my frustration when, and this nothing to you, because I think it's actually really cool that you just decided to be one of these guys to write about this, but like I sort of thought the next time it would happen, we'd get some of these details right, but it's just so hard when you're looking it up, and there's all these old stories are kind of referencing each other. It's sort of hard to get the real story to the top. But basically, he he came to he the long story of this guy is that he was a wealthy Anglo-Irish aristocrat, part of that, what they would have called the ascendancy class that went and colonized Ireland, that the British, starting, I mean, the colonization of Ireland started way back in like 1170 with Strongbow is the name
Mhm.
that's most associated with
Mhm.
that. Today he has a cider named after
Yep.
him that most will probably recognize, and as you get further and further along, and you get to like the 16th century during the Reformation period, Britain, England goes, well, we got a hold of Dublin now in this area, but out there, there's these Catholics out there in the sticks of Ireland, and we gotta civilize these people, and so they start expanding to try to colonize the rest of Ireland, and some of those battles that they were fighting against the you know, Irish, you know, um, chieftains at the time. Keep in mind this is the 1600s, so it's sort of, you might compare it to the colonization of North America here. Like these are the natives, and they some of these battles don't go so well. Specifically, this Battle of Blackwater, and they call in these cavalry troops from England, and one of them is named Paul Gore, and he is promised, if he can help put down you know this this these natives, that he will be gifted land as part of this aristocracy, and he they take this land through confiscation, and he then is able to use this gift of land to have a massive family, that just keeps sort of marrying into other families of this aristocracy all the way to the 1840s, and you get this major event, the Great Famine, that was, by that point in history, a lot of the people that own the land had just left it to be managed by these land agents who were really pretty ruthless. And if you're basically getting a paid as a cut on how much capital you can rot from the land, like, and you yourself don't actually own the land, you might not be quite as like understanding, like that, people are starving and dying, and so the entire Great Famine, sometimes called potato famine, and um other names, but is pretty much blamed on these absentee landlords, like not
Mm.
being there on their land, seeing the starvation and devastation that's happening. And the sort of the if there is such a thing as like sort of the good landlords, though, were the ones that were actually there, and were sort of helping this peasant class of these native Irish Catholics through this. And then the sort of ones that are considered more of the evildoers, by history, are the ones who just really weren't there and were, like, back in England, just reaping up the profits and that sort of thing. And that's our guy, Sir St.
Mhm.
George Gore. And that was really never known about him. But what we did know is that he came here to Colorado and went on a massive hunting expedition. And honestly, the only reason we even know that is because he built a huge road
Mm.
and carved his name in the tree at the top of the road. So, like in
Mm.
1850s, Colorado territory, or wasn't even territory yet, but in the West, the single most like legendary thing you could do to like make yourself, like get yourself into the annals of history and get your name on the tongues of people would have been to build a road that other settlers could follow, like specifically like a mountain pass road. So when he hears that there is, he's on one side of the pass and hunting buffalo, and he hears that there's good elk hunting grounds on the other side of this little footpath that was used by the Ute and the Arapaho tribes, essentially a war path. Those tribes would war with each other, and this little footpath was kind of their war path. You know, he went dang, like, let's get to the other side of this thing. I want to get my huge, crew of wagons. I got to have all my fine liqueurs and my, all of my provisions and everything. So I got to get these wagons over there. So let's widen this little footpath into a proper road.
Mm.
And so he builds Gore Pass, and Gore Pass is, for those who don't know, it's Highway 134. It's between Kremling and like Yampa,
Mhm. Yeah.
Taponis, that and it's a nice drive, it's a
Mm.
great road, but this is basically the first road on like the whole western slope of Colorado. Like it's like in the whole Continental Divide region, like this is the road that like every settler follows after that. So this road goes around. It's in the Gore Range. It is, but it goes around the like rugged peaks of the Gore Range. Like,
Mm.
and that's the point of the road, is to get around those massive peaks. And so the road gets named after him, of course, and then from there, quite logically, actually, it's like, well, this road goes around those peaks. What should we call those? The Gore, we'll call, it's Gore Pass. We'll call that Gore Range.
Mhm.
Okay, well, there's a big lake in there. What should we call that? Let's call it Gore Lake. There's a creek coming out of the lake. Let's call it Gore Creek. So, like, the very first, just like before we even get started, like on this big story, the whole idea that like, you know, he the Gore Range is shouldn't be named after him because he didn't contribute like significantly to the community in that area, which is an actual naming convention. Like according to the U.S. Geological Survey, like these names should be named after, if they're going to be named after a person, that person should have made a significant contribution like to the community. Like right off the bat, it's sort of based on faulty logic. And even the
Mhm.
people like in those stories you were citing are saying, oh, here's the Gore Range, and then there's some spin-offs like that, and that's the term that's used, some spin-offs
Mhm.
like Gore Pass and Gore Lake and Gore Creek. Well, no. Gore Range is the spin-off. Gore Pass is the original. And when
Mhm.
you get the um chronology right there, it makes a lot more sense of how we get to the point today that the Gore Range is named the Gore Range. It's like, well, yeah, there's a big road that gets you around it, so we'll name the range after the road.
Mhm.
And of course, with there's so many areas named after road makers in Colorado. I mean, I'm sitting in one right now. Vale is named after the
Mhm.
guy who built the road to take
Mhm.
you here. Charlie Vale. He was the highway engineer in Colorado. So right off the bat, that's sort of the very first thing that I knew that I wanted to kind of set the record straight on. And so
Mhm.
when I started looking into the actual source material on Gore and reading the books that had been written about him, because there's two other books too, one written in 77, one written in 97. Um, I just got very intrigued, as a investigator. I got like, if somebody says to you, we may never know when he got here, what route he took. Like those are questions that you go, damn, like I want to find out when
Hmm.
exactly he got here, what route he took, where else he went, how he made his money that allowed him to get here. And there, those guys that wrote those previous books didn't have access to digitization, and that's
Hmm.
what has made this entire story possible. Is you can now just search old newspapers. They're as searchable as a Google article. So now that all these old newspapers have been digitized, the entire Gore story of his hunting expedition, which was only based on three primary sources, two of which used the same sort of guy as the source, so like
Hmm.
really like two primary sources. Like now, thanks to the digitization of these newspapers, like I found hundreds of new source pieces of source material about Gore. So then just right when I first started researching him, um, I'll tell you, like, I also kind of got the idea because just like yourself, like a writer, within right in my newsroom, I sat next to him, Scott Miller. Again, like nothing against these guys; they're just sourcing from other material. But he wrote, you know, oh, he went on this hunting expedition in the wilderness, and he took no meat from his kills. And I just logically, to me, I'm going, how do you survive 3 years in the wilderness with 40 guys without taking any meat? Like, so I'm going, like, I just don't really know if that just doesn't sound right to me. And then the whole description of him in that same story as a a wealthy Irishman. Like in 1850, there's no such thing as a wealthy Irishman. That's just that. Like if you just know the very basics of history, you go, that should set off a red flag
Hmm.
right there. Like, you know, there was wealthy Anglo Irishmen, but like they like at that time, like, and even to this very day, like that ascendancy class that colonized Ireland, like you would refer to them as British or Anglo Irish, but you wouldn't really call a guy like that an Irishman, you
Hmm.
know? He wasn't even living in Ireland, but yes, he was born there. But so all these things led me to want to do this research this story more. Hopefully that I don't even remember what your original question
Oh,
was anymore.
that no, that was a great prelude into this hunting trip that took place. I think that's so much
Okay.
context that people will find really valuable. Yeah,
Okay.
like you said, I mean, um, digging around into this, you pretty much hear about this hunting trip, but you're right in the sense of like, unless you are going back to these sources that you were able to find, um, there's not much, and they all kind of do circular. There's like this circular aspect where they all
Yeah.
cite themselves, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it is tricky, and I think everyone just kind of grabs on to that headline of a lot of animals were slaughtered during this hunting trip, and then they don't really dig deeper than that. It's difficult to dig deeper than that when you have a bunch of sources, or at least the most readily available sources. Um, until people read your book, especially. um,
Yeah,
uh,
exactly. So
yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
not.
it makes sense. Yeah, yeah, and I think on the note of the animals that were killed too, that was something that crossed my mind. Where it's like you assume that there's at least some meat taking, right? Because you have 40 people that you are traveling with. Um, and I mean, I think that's really where you start to question, are those numbers accurate? But I guess before we get into that, um, maybe take us to that hunting trip and what were you able to track down about that hunting trip? And I guess what was Gore doing when he was in
Okay.
America? You know.
Yes. Okay. Let's do it. So this is another one that, people are going, well, he got here in 1854 because the first documentation anyone could ever find was what was a banknote.
Mhm.
And they called them drafts, a bank draft back then. And that's like how he was getting his money, you know, I mean, we'd use the term today like wired over, but really it's like the bank in St. Louis says, okay, I'll give you a few $1,000s because I have a relationship with the Bank of England and I know they're good for it. So, I'll write you this draft and I'll give you this money. And so the first sort of evidence that anyone else could find was a bank draft from March of 1854. So everyone goes, oh, he must have got here in 1854. And then everyone goes, well, how were people getting there back then? They probably came in right through New York, or possibly New Orleans. Well, that's wrong. He got here in 1853.
Mm.
And again, I think people were kind of sort of close to figuring this out, but couldn't quite get there. But if you were to look more into his family, like the guy who came along in 97 was like so close to finding this detail, but just didn't find it. But like the if you were to look more into his family, you'd have learned that a lot of his family had immigrated to Canada because there was these there was a lot of these guys were sort of in military and other things, and there were these Canadian sort of conflicts happening where it wasn't called Canada, it was called British North America. And like they were sort of importing um you know generals and things from British North America, um many of which were the Gores. So if you go up to Canada today and you go like into like the Quebec area, there's a township called Gore.
Hmm.
There's in Nova Scotia, there's another town called, there's like several places in Canada named Gore, and it's the same family. So like that like that right there should tell you, well, maybe he didn't come in through
Mhm.
America as we know it. Maybe he came in through British North America. And in fact, that is where he came a full year earlier than anyone realized. He came in um, through Montreal and Quebec. And that's how he got to North America. And and by the way, I don't mind. I'm just going to say that you still have to, like, these are sort of some spoilers that we get to in the early chapters of the book, but some of the stuff in the later chapters that I'm not going to get into is
Mhm.
so mind-blowing about this guy that like you're still going to want to like read this stuff. So these are just sort of scene setters, but like so he got here a full year earlier. He actually got here in 1853, and he traveled the entire country hunting and fishing along the way. He started with like a fishing expedition in the Great Lakes region, which probably would have been Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, that area. And we know he traveled through Illinois.
Mhm.
And because there's a report of someone stealing his luggage in Illinois on his way down. So,
Yeah,
and
before
he
you keep
was
going there, out of curiosity, how were you able to find that he arrived in Canada first? What type of, source material did you find?
digitization of old
Yeah.
Canadian newspapers. So
Okay.
thankfully, he has a unique enough name. You
Mhm.
know, having the Sir prefix, which everyone used, like, you know, there were guys named George Gore, but there's only one Sir
Mhm.
George Gore. And especially, his name was actually St. George, which is kind of funny too. Like, we think, like, what kind of a
Mhm.
name is that? But St. George was a common name. Like there's Utah, St. George, right? and
Mhm.
and like there were Civil War guys, Philip St. George Cook and things like that. So but then when you put that together as a search term, Sir St. George Gore, or even just Sir George Gore, suddenly you're not wading through you know um tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of hits. Suddenly you're only wading through thousands or hundreds of hits. And so I kind of went to the some of the earliest ones that I could find. You can view the hits by the years that they
Mhm.
come in. And so you'd see like these other Sir St. George Gores, which in like 1700s and stuff would have been his,
Mhm.
you know, uncles and grandparents and things like that. And then you sort of get this lull, and then all of a sudden 1853 and 1840s, and when then you go by region, you
Mhm.
get 1853 is the first time he starts popping up in North America in Canadian and US newspapers. And again, with this digitization stuff, like when you're able to narrow down by date, by region, all that, suddenly you can get to, okay, bing, here's the very first one. And
Mhm.
it's just a ship record of him arriving with four servants
Mm.
into Montreal. So that's, I mean, that's a big one right there. So
Oh, yeah.
so
That's
now I go,
amazing. That's
yes. So
amazing.
now I go, okay, he didn't get here in 54. He got
Mhm.
here in 53, and here's the proof. And
Yeah.
so, yeah. Anyway, so then he he was fishing and hunting and all that around. He starts making his way down. He gets his luggage stolen in Illinois. And it was like a expensive trunk. I love the thought of like someone right now, still to this day, like it was like an expensive, like they called it like a portmanteau or whatever, like type of trunk filled with like gold rings
Mhm.
and like to this day, I would bet you, Spencer, that this trunk, somebody has this thing. Like it's somewhere. And like it was stolen from him off the train, and it's sort of his own fault. He like gets off the train. Like the train's gonna make a stop, and he like gets off to whatever, and then he's like, I came back, 15 minutes later, and the train had left. The train left me at the station. I can just picture him being like,
Oh,
oh, I
exactly.
came here and the train has gone. And so like, the train leaves without him. He has to catch the next train. When he gets down to catch up with the other train, someone had taken his stuff. And so like, that happened in like November or December of 53, 1853. And then he gets down to St. Louis, which would have been sort of a big major US sort of nexus at that time. You could travel down, because the other thing that enables all this is the advent of steamship technology. So this guy, he left Liverpool. So like, no, he didn't travel from Ireland to the US. He traveled from England to Canada, right? And
Mhm.
he left the port of Liverpool, and then he arrived in Montreal, and the whole trip took 8 days. So like, this guy is like, this whole luxurious steamship travel is what also made this possible. Like, I don't think this guy might have done the travel the old way, where it takes 40 days or whatever. And so he's coming down, he's taking trains and steamers and things like that to get around, and he finally gets to St. Louis, and he he stops in St. Louis. They make note of it in the newspaper in December of 53, and he goes, I'm going to keep hunting. I'm going to go down to this Texas Mexico region where I hear there's good hunting. And they said at that time he had a bunch of guys with him.
Hmm.
And so the whole thing of him, like, it was the assumption when he got that, when people found that bank draft in March of 54, like, oh, he must have needed that bank draft to hire these guys to do this Western expedition. Well, that's a good assumption, but probably incorrect, because, like, or I mean, I should say it's a logical assumption, but probably incorrect, because we can see that he already had a bunch of guys already. And
Mhm.
so then he goes down to the Texas Mexico area and hunts down there for a few months, and
Mm.
then comes back to St. Louis. So before he ever even started his like sort of journey, west, he had already traveled the entire country from north to south,
Wow.
hunting all along the way.
That's incredible that you were
So
able to
like
track all that down.
your figure that you came up with, like, probably, around 10,000 animals, as I posit in the book, th- it could be way more than that, because
Mhm.
we don't even know how many animals he had killed in this entire north south expedition.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, so okay, so he goes down to Texas, then he goes back to St. Louis.
Yeah.
What makes
Okay.
him is
All
at
right.
that
So
point, does he
then,
go yeah.
all right. So
Oh,
then there's I'll take you. I'll sort of. I'll start with um much of what we think we know about Gore comes from the first book that was written about him in 77. That was written by a painter named Jack Roberts, who was commissioned by Manor Vale Hotel here in Vale to they wanted to have their restaurant be like named after like a luxurious western sort of thing, and they thought, well, let's name it the Lord Gore because like, this guy traveled in style and luxury and ate the finest, cuts and drank the finest wines, and we're going to call our restaurant Lord Gore. But since there's no pictures of or anything of this guy, let's hire this painter, Jack Roberts, who does like famous sort of Crestone guy. You can find a lot more about him. He was an awesome painter of Western scenes. Let's hire Jack Roberts to like paint us a bunch of pictures of this Gore expedition and Gore himself. So Robert starts doing a lot of research for his paintings, and he comes across this interesting detail from a guy who said, I I met Gore and went and was invited to join this expedition. And when I met him in St. Louis in '54, it wasn't just him. It was Gore and another guy named Fitzwilliams, Lord Charles Wentworth. There's another name in there, Fitzwilliams, and the two of them were together. And so Roberts goes, okay, well, so that's where Gore got the idea for this.
Mm.
Fitzwilliams was one of these like English travelers, and these guys were kind of fascinated with the idea of the Western safari at that time. This would have been before the whole like like this would have been before like like alligator hunting and some of these African safaris were really in fashion. So the Western safari to those guys was like this like kind of fascinating idea. And they would guys like Fitzwilliam would come here. I mean, by here I mean just the West, and do these safaris. And so Fitzwilliam had went on this big hunting expedition out west, and he was more up in like Pacific Northwest and all that, but he
Mhm.
had come through a few places that Gore would end up taking. And then the two of them are both in St. Louis at the same time. And that also I was able to trace as fact, not previously known, that the two of them absolutely are in St. Louis at the same time. But the next guy who comes along to write about him in '97, he is his name's Barry Johnson. He was an English researcher, and he did a lot of great research into Gore's family. And he said there's no way Fitzwilliam was with on this expedition because he got married here in England in August of
Mm.
'54. So Robert said Fitzwilliam and Lord Gore were together on this big expedition. And then the next guy, Johnson, comes along and says, no, Fitzwilliam wasn't with. Sorry. Well,
Mm.
what I was able to find is that, you know, the reason for this confusion is that Fitzwilliam and Sir St. George Gore were both in St. Louis at the same time in March of '54. So the guy who wrote this letter to the Denver Post in '97 that Roberts came across that said, I know when I met them, it was two English guys, Fitzwilliam and Gore. He's right. Like
Mm.
they like, of course, if they're both these wealthy Englishmen at, British guys in the city of St. Louis at the same time, they're probably hanging out together.
Mm.
And so and this is probably where Gore, for all we know, he only wanted to just go from north to south. But he gets together with Fitzwilliam and gets this idea in his head about doing a Western expedition as well. And then I was able to find all the details. And sure enough, Fitzwilliam then by like May or something, he's gone and he's headed back to England. So, but Gore meets up with Fitzwilliam and gets and they start like interviewing people to like help on this expedition. And they they the guy who wrote that letter to the Denver Evening Post, who said he saw him, his name's Henry Chatillon, and that's Henry with a Y, and he would have just been called Henry. But his uncle Henri is spelled Henry with an I, and he would have been pronounced Henri, and he was like a famous French fur trapper who the um Pa- Parkman's book, The Oregon Trail, is sort of based on that guy. And
Hmm.
so that guy would have been kind of a sort of a legendary guide to hire. And so Gore did hire him out of St. Louis. So when his nephew writes in, he's like, yeah, and he hired my uncle Henri. And so they then depart out of St. Louis on this expedition. And what route do they take? Well, of course, the Oregon Trail. Like that's what Henri would have been really known for. The book, the original Oregon Trail book, is like based on him. So or he's like one of the major characters in it. And so so they start taking this Oregon Trail and they stop through the very first stop would have been the modern day Kansas City area. They go through like Fort Kearny in Nebraska, and there's crazy little stories of like 20 years after Gore leaves Fort Kearny, like someone comes and says, "Why are there so many of these like English greyhounds running around?" And they're like, "Oh, this guy, this wealthy English hunter left some dogs behind, and they've just you know
Yeah.
proliferated since then." And so like Gore, this guy is just leaving in his wake. He's like in the book, I call him like sort of like a Napoleon like figure for outdoor recreation because like Napoleon was called history on horseback because he would travel around and sort of like spread like revolution and revolutionary ideas and like change history as he went. And like for outdoor recreation, Gore was doing this.
Hmm.
He's leaving these dogs behind that like if you're in Kearney, Nebraska, maybe even today, and there's a greyhound there, very well could have descended from him. And people had never seen greyhounds in that town. And he's building roads and he's introducing new hunting and fishing techniques and stuff. And so they're kind of slowly making their way. They get to this area, and there's a lot of confusion about. I personally think that he gets in sort of a fight with Henri and decides, you know what? Uh, and Henri wrote about this in his journal. We parted ways after not that long. We weren't. I found him to be a disagreeable Johnny Bull. And keep in mind the French and the British not
Hmm.
exactly on friendly terms. So you can just picture that Gore and this French guy probably aren't really getting along that well. And
Hmm.
Gore decides, no, I got a way better guy to lead this expedition, Jim Bridger. And like Bridger's like the Don. He's
Hmm.
just like, I mean, Bridger is so, he would have been like, I guess the equivalent of today, like, I don't know, like a Shaun White or something, like a legendary outdoor recreation figure in the West. And so he hooks up with Bridger instead and gets rid of Henri. And there's reports, and in fact, that guy Henry, Henri's nephew, said they went all the way to Fort Bridger. Fort Bridger is way like in the southwest corner of Wyoming, like near Utah. And then another guy later comes along and says, "I found an old like a like a axle from a specific type of wagon that belonged to Gore, and he finds it in modern day Utah." So I think those guys made it all the way to basically that sort of corner of like Colorado, Utah,
Hmm.
Wyoming, and then came across from the other direction. And I think they built Gore Pass not from east to west as was previously assumed, because a lot of people are thinking, oh, they're traveling from east to west. They probably built Gore Pass going that way. I think they went up and around, got all the way over here, and then are coming back this way because
Hmm.
how could 40 guys build a 25-mile winding road that has, they're not just cutting trees, they're grading the road. Like there's evidence of grading. And well, a previous biographer said, and there's really no like hard source on this. He just sort of said Well, no, Jim Bridger said that he hired a tribe of native indigenous to do this. And other people have went, no, he didn't. No. And well, Bridger was married to a Ute woman. He could speak Ute. He could also speak the Arapaho language. He could have, if they were coming, east to west, and they hired this tribe, it could have been the Arapaho, you
Mm.
know. But to me, I think what makes more sense, because Bridger had good relations with the Ute, and like I said, was married to a Ute woman. And I think they probably built it actually from west to east, and then went
Mm.
back up to Fort Laramie from there. And we know by winter of 54-55, he was up at Fort Laramie in Wyoming. But we also know that he was absolutely at Gore Pass simply because the road exists. Like
Yeah.
that, that's just hard evidence right there, you know. And also,
Mhm.
they carved their name in a tree there that they found years later. And then years later, Bridger guides Berthoud, from Berthoud
Mhm.
Pass. He guides him, and they take Gore Pass. And Berthoud says, "How the hell did this road get here?" And Bridger goes, Lord Gore, he carved his name right there in the tree, and they find this is happening in 1861. And so I did find one more piece of what I'll call evidence to support my theory that he probably hired the Ute tribe. The Ute, they unfortunately they don't really have any like record of any of this. And they just don't, a lot of their traditions are oral, and no one's been able to really find why the famous photographer Hillers, who was with Powell on the Powell expedition in the late Powell expeditions plural in the late 1860s, early 1870s. This is where he Powell goes down, um, makes that famous expedition through the Grand Canyon. He rafts
Mhm.
the whole Colorado. This is when all this is going down. He brings a photographer with him, Hillers, and today in Colorado, in the Gore Range, one of the peaks is named Mount Powell because they climbed that peak and they left a register there. A register is means like a tin canteen with a handwritten note in it
Mhm.
saying like, we were here, we climbed this. And so Hillers takes a photo of takes a couple photos of these Ute men, they look to be around like age maybe, I don't know, 15 to 25. And these guys are proudly displaying their dogs. And
Mm.
what kind of dogs are they? They're not
Yeah.
like the wolf like, exactly. They're not
Yeah.
the wolf like, dogs that this tribe would have used and stuff. They're these English hunting hounds.
Mhm.
Where the hell did they get these? I mean, possibly Mormon settlers coming across and stuff, but I mean, these dogs are identical, spitting image to the staghound, the British staghound. That Gore, he was a staghound guy. Like, he bred staghounds. He loved staghounds. And
Mm.
when he gets done with his expedition, finally, all these years later, we know for a fact that he started with like dozens of these dogs because that was documented. When he gets done, he doesn't have a single dog left.
Mm.
So he was using them as currency. He was trading with them and doing other things with them. And there's a photo of Ute men posing. So this would have been evidence of a possible interaction and possibly used for currency. And so if Bridger said, and people are like, oh, Bridger, he told tall tales all the time. But when you really look, his tall tales would be like, people would be like, have you ever heard of a petrified tree? And Bridger goes, I know petrified trees, and they got petrified birds singing petrified songs. And like, so it's like, but then when you look, actually, he's right. In the Yellowstone region, there is this whole area of petrified trees that he was really referring to. Or
Mhm.
Bridger, he'd say stuff like, I know a place where the fish can swim from one side of the continental divide to the other. And they're like, what, fish are swimming over a mountain? Well, no. In Yellowstone, there actually is this one little convergence of these rivers where fish can cross the continental divide.
Mm.
He would say, I know a place you can catch a fish and it'll be cooked by the time you reel it in. There's a trout stream up there with these boiling hot little pockets
Mm.
that you could pull. So like, these
Wow.
tall tales of Bridgers are actually based on truth. And people who, like other biographers and people who knew Bridger, said he was actually a very honest guy. And that's why he
Hmm.
has such a great reputation, why he was beloved by these native tribes. Later on in the Sioux Wars, you get stories of native tribes like refusing to attack, like the Crows, like refused to attack this base because they heard Bridger was there. So, like,
Hmm.
I think, no, we got to take Bridger at his word. And maybe he exaggerated. Maybe Gore didn't hire 800 natives, but he probably hired natives to cut Gore Pass. And the Ute is, like there's the Ute are then there, like 15 years later, posing with English hunting hounds. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, it makes
Anyways,
sense.
so
Yeah,
yeah,
that would make sense.
yeah. So this is all stuff that I sort of put forth in the book to kind of add some new, a new dimension to the story. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then from there they go up to Fort Laramie. They go, they're finding gold all over the place. They're, and every time they find gold, Gore's going, nah, nah, that's not gold. That's fool's gold. And then later he's like saying to like Bridger and those guys, like, dude, you might want to go back there and check that out later. That actually was gold. But he doesn't want gold, and he knows that gold will ruin his expedition. The guys will get gold fever, and that'll
Mhm.
be it. That will be the end of his, like, if they find gold, these guys are gonna hightail it out, and he lost all his men, and that's it. He might
Mhm.
die out there, honestly, after that. Like if he loses all his men and stuff. And so, turn this light on. It's getting dark. So like they make it all the way up to um the through Wyoming into Montana, into the Black Hills region of Wyoming.
Mm.
Like Black Hills, I think it's also important to distinguish between like Black Hills of South Dakota, which we
Mhm.
typically would think of, but there's, Black Hills of Wyoming, same range but kind of other sides. So that's probably when they say gourmet to the Black Hills east, that's probably the side, the Wyoming side. Then
Mhm.
he gets to like the modern day North Dakota area and one of the forts there, and misses the last steamer back down to St. Louis. And the chief crow's breast of the Hidatsa tribe says, "Oh, dude, take yeah, you're gonna have to stay here all winter. You can live in one of my like these sort of, the Hidatsa built these sort of um like they would call them like a earth lodge, like built into the sort of the side of the hill, these like lodges,
Mhm.
and Gore hangs out there for the whole winter. Like the idea of this like British aristocrat who has like, literal castles back in Ireland, and you know he's like living, in this earth lodge, like barely sort of surviving at the end of the trip, is kind of a cool dimension to the story. And in fact,
Mhm.
the previous biographer Barry Johnson found that part to be so interesting that he named his biography Baronet in an Earth Lodge. So that's the name
Mm.
of that one if you want. But that one, like, I think, unfortunately, he just didn't have access to the digitization like I did. So his is extremely factual. It puts to rest a lot of the stuff that Roberts had said that wasn't true. And by the way, if you read the foreword of Roberts' book, which nobody ever did, unfortunately, like you skip past the foreword, in the foreword, he says, look, a lot of this stuff is like, I don't know if this is true or not, but like
Mm.
I got to keep this story flowing here. So I'm just going to make stuff up that if I don't know it to be true. Yeah, his word was surmise.
Yeah.
And like, I mean, to this day, this stuff in that book is just taken as fact.
Mhm.
And so yeah, so that's like where we get a lot of those details that just, aren't necessarily right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, and
Dang.
yeah, anyways.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating. So, I mean, honestly, at that point, then this number of animals that Gore is responsible for slaughtering, quote unquote, is totally just a guess or a fabrication or
Yeah,
just
there
yeah.
was a guy, yeah, he feuded with a guy from the, there would be these guys called Indian agents, and they would be kind of assigned to the reservations. And I think, here in Colorado, like the most famous Indian agent would have been, Meeker, right? And the
Mhm.
whole Meeker I don't think they use the term Meeker massacre anymore. It was essentially a, sort of a battle between settlers and the natives, but like these Indian Gore kind of was like feuding with one of these Indian agents, and that's the term, Indian agents. Like
Mhm.
I prefer to use native indigenous, but and I think that's sort of seen as like, but yeah, that was their literal title, Indian agent. And one of those guys says it's just the whole thing of him like slaughtering animals to leave them lie is based on like three words from one letter of the guy saying he is killing purely for sport.
Mm.
That's it. And like from that, we just get this whole thing of he never took it, to like my guy Scott Miller at Vale Daily being like he took no meat, and
No.
so like
That's
the
wild. That's only from just, like, a little statement from
it,
someone he was feuding with. That is
isn't
wild.
that, yeah, but in that letter he says Gore told me that he killed 2,000 buffalo, 1,500 like ungulates, elk and deer and stuff, 500 bear, like that's where we get that number. But
Mhm.
there's um there's other reports as well of him killing more, and that's where I think you cited like Colorado Sun had done a story that said I might have been more like 4,000
Mhm.
buffalo.
Mm.
And then there's another letter from this guy Miggs, who was like a like an architect working on the post office in DC. Like, why the
Mm.
hell is this guy like? Where is he getting his? Well, he went to West Point. He had really good relations, probably with these old graduates of West Point. Gore is encountering these guys, and maybe these guys are writing letters to Miggs and stuff, and Miggs goes, I heard he killed 6,000 buffalo. And so maybe Miggs actually, like, that people have sort of discounted that. Like, why did this post office guy, like, or this architect guy, um, know anything? And like, I sort of go, oh, maybe we should look into that more. Like, maybe Miggs was had access to more information because Gore was encountering these guys like in the battle battle of the Blue Water, which is now known as the Harney Massacre.
Mm.
Gore's actually mentioned in the journal of one of the guys who was there, because Gore's the guy leading the Gore's expedition at that time, Louis Vasquez. Bridger had to go home because his son was dying, and so Bridger went home and then came back. And while they're hanging out at Fort Laramie waiting for Bridger, this whole thing breaks out nearby, and Vasquez goes over there and tries to maybe negotiate and get these two factions to, like, prevent this massacre, and it sort of interprets between the two, and the guy writes into his journal like, oh, and some this dude Louis Vasquez, this old mountain man, like, came by and tried to, like, be an intermediary, and he said, hey, if you want peace you can have it, or if you want war you can have that. That's like the word for word
Mm.
quote. And he's a right now he's over at Fort Laramie as a guide for Sir St. George Gore. So just crazy to think that in the, like, source material journals from the Harney Massacre, Gore gets mentioned in that. Like,
That's
it's so
wild
crazy.
just how many times throughout this entire, epic adventure, how many times he's actually documented along the way.
Dude,
That's
that's what
incredible.
I mean. That's what I find so fascinating too, Spencer, is like they he's mentioned, like, when he finds gold in the Black Hills, they think that like like people think, well, why did Custer bring a geologist when Custer, was on his what we now know is probably a death march. He's on his way to just get, his ass kicked out there at Battle of Little Bighorn. He stops through the Black Hills on the way, and and but he brings a geologist with him. Why would he do that? Because there was rumors of gold, and
Mhm.
Custer was like politically minded, and he thought, man, if I could go put down this conflict with the Sioux, find gold, come back in time for the centennial, July 4th, 1876. I will ride this into the White House. Maybe I'll be president one day. Like,
Mhm.
I heard a historian saying that, like, if he if he would have if he would have just brought the Gatling guns that he had with him, then just decide, like, he thought, nah, I'll take on these natives with my six shooters, and like he had like industrial revolution technology with him, like Gatling gun, and he just didn't bring them anyway.
Yeah.
So Custer just gets his ass kicked, as we all know. He dies and and doesn't make it back. He was in a rush to get back in time for like the parade of the centennial, but like,
Mhm.
why was he why did he bring the geologist with? Because there were rumors of gold. Where'd the rumors of gold come from? This Gore expedition. It's just
Mhm.
crazy how Gore has his fingerprints on so many little incidents from history at that time.
Yeah, this honestly sounds like it should be some sort of like a Hollywood movie in this regard, like
Well,
just a giant.
dude,
Yeah.
again, I mean, yeah, you like, I
It's
don't
like
you
almost
haven't
like the
actually read the
Forrest
book
Gump
yet,
in a
have you?
sense. Huh?
You haven't actually read the
No, I
book
haven't
yet,
read your book. I just
because
found
I
out about
know
your
I'm
book.
going to get you a copy.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that's better, though, honestly, because
Mhm.
your questions are sort of then more. But the previous guys who have written about him used lines like, "Hollywood never dreamed of such a story,"
Mhm.
and like it every time it comes up with a lot of these guys, they go like, "This is a Hollywood story here." So
Mhm.
like you too, like
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's one of those like it, like the Forrest Gump aspect where it's like all these little breadcrumbs along the way that have these huge rippling effects. Yeah, I
dude,
mean, that's a
dude,
incredible
totally,
story
yeah.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, I want to ask more questions, but I also don't want to reveal everything that's in the book
No,
either.
no. I'm not. I'm leaving. The end of this book
Mhm.
has stuff in it that just that I'm not going to get into. More stuff about his personal life and that type of stuff that is like
Mhm.
it's just like mind blowing. So yeah. So we won't. I mean, he comes back to the U.S. He
Mhm.
Nobody knew this. There was only ever one mention in any single story. One person found his obituary, and the obituary said, "Oh yeah, yeah," and then 20 years later, he went back to Florida. I found all the details of that. He did a whole nother expedition. Like
Oh,
I got
wow.
all that in the book. I got all like so there's way more stuff. Yeah. So we're only focusing right now on the West and Colorado, I mean,
Mhm.
for obviously your podcast and but like yeah, in this book it gets into all this other stuff about him too that we won't get into now. But yeah. So like you get through the first half of the book is mainly what we have just talked about, but then yeah, the second half is all this other stuff. So
So, I guess one question I did have then, would be you tend to hear that the public viewed him as a jerk, like just like this awful guy, um, out there slaughtering animals. Uh, does that all of that just come from essentially from this one letter
yes,
where and that's where this negative opinion of him comes from?
one letter. Yep. Yep.
Wow.
And I should say the guy wrote two letters,
Mhm.
but the detail about killing for sport was one letter. And yeah, that guy he kind of had an axe to grind with Gore. They were getting into little like a band of, I think it was the Blackfeet, like tried to steal some of the horses from the Gore expedition, and they were getting into little squabbles along the way. And um the reason why that guy got into such a big feud with them is because they thought they had a deal, because Gore had this massive pile of trophies, like heads and things, and he wanted to like get these all back basically to England. And in fact, he did manage to get one massive elk head all the way back to the Brighton Museum in England. I don't know if it's still there. I kind of always wanted to try to find that out, but I reached out to them and like they didn't know. But anyways, he makes this deal with these guys, these government agents, and their pseudo. They would have little titles like captain and stuff, but they weren't really actual like military guys. But anyways, they'd be assigned to these um, outposts and stuff, and they had a deal, and then the terms of the deal didn't. Gore thought they were trying to like rip him off or something,
Mhm.
so he basically just takes all of his stuff and just burns it one night in this massive, it's been called like the most famous bonfire in the history of the West because the amount of like valuables and stuff that all just went up in smoke. And so that, because he did that bonfire and he could have, like, he was like he didn't want these guys even to like use the scrap metal from his wagon, so he was like throwing the metal in the creek. And so like that is a like a thing, a dick move, and so like that, people go, well, yeah, he's just a jerk. And so because that was kind of a jerkish thing to do, but again, like, kind of from his perspective, he thought like, these guys, we had a deal, they want all my stuff now. They were supposed to build these boats for me. We had agreed on a price. Now they're not doing it. They want way more. They want my stuff. I would rather burn it than give it to these guys. So that's why he's considered. But another thing that sort of annoys me, like, I'll just say that Karen Stiegelmeier, when she was testifying, like, to these different councils and things about why she wanted to change the name of the Gore range, she said that it's universal. Like, this is her quote. Like, it's universal in any writings about the guy that he was um not liked, like despised by the government, the mountain men, and the natives. And I'm telling you, that is false. That's not just like, oh, maybe. That's false. There's like, we know that um that Chief Crowsbreast of the Hidatsa let gave Gore his residence to stay in. We know that Jim Bridger, the most respected mountain man at the time, had nothing but good things to say about Gore. If you read the source material, based on like the one of the guys in the expedition, the guy said, "Dude, he was awesome. I needed all these supplies to get back to leave the expedition. I said, all I have is $10. He gave me hundreds of dollars worth of stuff and just said, thanks for doing a great job." He was like, so the mountain man, and then and then Gore meets up with like this government agent at the end of his expedition who said, oh yeah, like, I found him to be like cool guy. Like, he was,
Mm.
he is very chill. He has this quote like, this is the in America, he's a product of what we would call social democracy, which it's like pretty wrong, but that's like a way of, so, like, it's just hilarious to associate a guy with the aristocracy with like social democracy. But what he meant by that was like, he was willing to share his stuff,
Mhm.
willing to, and so like he so he so like those three things that Karn cited, natives, mountain men, and government, and saying it's universal across all writings, like, that's just not true. Like,
Mm.
he wasn't like, he and for there's plenty of other reasons why Gore was an absolute villain. Like, I mean, he was, when he went on his way there, he stopped by through Kansas City, like, as the like Kansas Nebraska Act was going into effect, and the like territorial legislature was passing these like pro slavery laws that would break out the bleeding Kansas violence that leads to the Civil War in that area. And that's like where the biggest Civil War battle west of the Mississippi was fought, was in this modern day Kansas City area. It's called Battle of Westport. Gore was like hanging out with the guy who would later like give his house to the South to use as their base. So like, there's plenty of reasons why Gore like is a villain of history. I mean, he's
Mhm.
a British colonizer, partially responsible for the damn famine. He's hanging out with Southern sympathizers and all that. But if you're specifically referencing why you want to change the name of the Gore range because it's universal in all writings that he was not well liked by mountain men, government agents, and natives, and that he didn't do anything of significance to benefit the community, that is abjectly false. So yeah, so that's my whole thing of, because a lot of people ask me, well, do you think it should be changed? And my answer is just kind of preempting. I know you were going to ask. I know you were going to ask that. Like, and just to sort of preempt that question from you and keep hogging the mic this whole time. Like he, I, if we go through a democratic process, like I sort of liken it to the wolves thing here. Like I know that like these wolves are out here on the western slope. Like people don't like wolf reintroduction but like I do think we still have to respect democracy in this state and accept the fact that the west slope and the the front range have a symbiotic relationship, and we are part of the same like uh, economic engine that drives this state, and we are part of the same state. And if the people on the front range say we want to introduce wolves on the western slope, that is still democracy, and we have to respect that. And so like am I in favor of the wolves? Well, I am, simply because I know it was close, and I know that, but it passed. It was democratically, this was a democratic process, and the same thing goes for the Gore range. If we undergo a democratic process and we change the names, fine. I don't think we, like, names change. It was Istanbul and now it's Constantinople. That song, like, it was Istanbul, now Constantinople, and even old New York was once New Amsterdam. Like,
Hmm.
this is a song about names changing. Like, names change. This is, and but I just think that, like, you know, and if it's democratically done, fine. But I just think we have to, like, have the facts right before we start deciding on this. And when you have people sort of testifying with wrong facts, I mean, that's like, that's what I would say. And then furthermore, I mean, this is the final point I make. So this is a spoiler, but I just, for your viewers, this is, I make the point in the end, and this is sort of like the banger that I sort of leave you with at the end. Gore was a wealthy tourist seeking outdoor recreation. Okay. And now Vale has Gore Creek running through it. Okay. What is Vale? Vale is an area that caters to wealthy tourists seeking outdoor recreation. Okay. So, what is Gore, a bad name? Or is it actually the most perfect name? You know,
Hmm.
like, is it real, or is it a mirror that we are holding up to our face? So, like, yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, I think that is the perfect way to end this and tease people into wanting to check out this book. You want to give us one more plug here for what the book's name
I
is?
know it
And
might be sort of uncouth to, like, use a podcast to plug another podcast kind of
oh
thing,
yeah,
but
no, go
I'm
for it.
doing another one called Tracked Out,
Hmm.
and that's going to be trackedout.co. And I think it would be cool for your listeners. They might want to check that out too.
Hmm.
And then just this book, yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And
And
you
the
you
book
can
is
get the
called
book anywhere. Yeah.
Get the book anywhere, called Notorious Hunter Sir St. George Gore, Deadly Legacy in Colorado. So
Thanks. Yeah.
there we go. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out and talk about this today, man. This was a fascinating, absolutely fascinating chat. You really seem to know what you're talking about, and rightfully so
Thanks,
after all
dude.
of that research. So I learned a ton. I'm sure our audience will too. So
Hey,
yeah.
hey, I just want to say one more thing, Spencer.
Hmm.
When I reached out to you, like, I feel embarrassed to say, I honestly thought, I wonder if this guy's even gonna respond. And dude, you went in there immediately. You corrected these details in the story. You got back to me right away, and you, like, genuinely, like, there's this thing that we need to get over as reporters, that we're sort of like competing, or that we're never wrong, and you are just like the epitome of, like, what it should be, where it's like, no, we work together, if we get it wrong, if a one reporter like yourself gets something wrong, another reporter is the one who's likely to notice. And so like, yeah, I just think it's so cool that you're like so you know, open to, and then you're like, well, let's do a podcast about it. And so like, yeah, like I think you're doing a great job and you're open-minded, and your show, I always like enjoy like sort of your I've learned about Colorado history, things I just never knew. Um God, that one that you had about that crazy election, like 1925 I know you probably don't even
I'm
remember,
like
but
trying to think which one that was.
and I remember like listening to your podcast, learning about that, and then going on this deep dive to like learn more, you know? So yeah, dude, like just keep up the good work. I love your show.
Hey, well, hey, I really appreciate hearing that. And I mean, hey, like you said, I'm always happy to learn from my mistakes.
Right.
I think that's how everything kind of gets pushed forward, just like with how there were two predecessors to your book, it's like you're able to kind of use what they've done and then use that as like a leap pad into the next era of that story. So I mean, yeah, I really appreciate the kind words though, and really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and share the story that you have to share here. So
Cool, dude.
yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, if there's anything else you ever want to chat about,
Oh, dude,
yeah,
for sure.
we'll
Yeah.
get you
I'll
back
hit you
on
up.
and
Yeah.
get
Yeah.
another look, whether it's up in Vale or anywhere else. So yeah, we'll be in touch.
Sweet.
But yeah, until next time, here with John LaConte today, and this is the Out There Colorado podcast.